Hello, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, the Russia-Ukraine geopolitical chessboard just faced an unprecedented shock. In just 7 short days, what was considered the economic fortress of the Kremlin has turned into a pile of smoldering ashes. These are no longer isolated clashes, but a carefully calculated all-out campaign aimed at choking off the lifeblood of Russia's war machine. In today's video, we will analyze the week of hell in the Baltic Sea, where Ukraine accomplished what years of Western sanctions could not. This war is not only being fought in the trenches, it is raging right at critical energy infrastructure. Can Moscow recover after losing billions of dollars each week? Or is this the beginning of an irreversible collapse? In the fierce flow of war, a single week can sometimes feel as long as a decade, where every strategic calculation can be overturned in the blink of an eye. For Russia, the past 7 short days have been nothing short of a living nightmare, turning hopes for a recovering oil-based economy into a smoldering pile of ashes under the pressure of Ukraine's long-range attacks. What we are witnessing is truly a week of hell for the Kremlin, as the hard-earned achievements accumulated over time are mercilessly stripped away by direct blows to the economic lifelines. In just 1 week, Ukraine has accomplished what international sanctions would have taken years to achieve, leaving Russia stunned amid the rubble. Everything started to go wrong at the end of March, when news spread about a large-scale attack on the Ust-Luga port on the Baltic coast. This is not just an ordinary seaport, but a super oil and gas complex with a processing capacity of up to 700,000 barrels of exported oil per day, not to mention other strategic goods such as grain, fertilizer, and coal. An attack here would mean delivering a critical blow to the Baltic export network, which accounts for up to 40% of Russia's total oil sales. For Mr. Putin, this is not just bad news, but a strategic disaster. Looking at the bigger picture, the event at the end of March was not a single attack. It was like a bold exclamation mark ending a week-long campaign targeting both Ust-Luga and another important port, Primorsk. In fact, that was the 4th time in a week that Ukrainian drones struck Ust-Luga. This constant pressure sends a strong message to Moscow. The oil and gas infrastructure that was once considered invulnerable is now nothing more than a target for attacks. In fact, not only are they targets, but Ukraine has proven that they can strike these places whenever they want. Primorsk has also suffered the same bitter fate with relentless attacks, creating a series of dark days that the Russians feel may never end. According to analytical reports, Ukraine's campaign to attack Baltic seaports began on March 23 with what seemed like isolated strikes. Many once believed this was a temporary reaction to Russia exploiting Middle East chaos, but reality proved otherwise. On the contrary, right on the first day, consecutive explosions shook Primorsk and set fire to fuel tanks at this port. It should be noted that when operating at full capacity, Primorsk can store more than 900,000 tons of crude oil and hundreds of thousands of tons of oil products. What started as a small-scale raid quickly escalated into a full-scale campaign with a scope and intensity far beyond any of Russia's contingency scenarios. The pride of Russia's defense systems was shattered as Ukrainian drones traveled hundreds of miles, slipping through air defense barrages or simply entering deadly gaps to wreak havoc. After a week of violence, Moscow was forced to face a harsh reality. Everything in Ust-Luga and Primorsk was burning. The statistics say it all. 3 fuel tanks at Ust-Luga were completely destroyed in the attack on March 29, turning 90,000 tons of oil into dust. A few days earlier, another attack wiped out 5 tanks with a capacity of 150,000 tons and also hit 3 transport ships of the Ghost Fleet that were docked at the port. The damage at Primorsk was just as severe, forcing Russia to order a complete halt to oil loading several times over the past week to put out the fires and assess the damage. In reality, it will take weeks or even months of maintenance to bring these seaports back to their original capacity. Even when repairs begin, the threat of further attacks still looms, because there is no guarantee that Russia can prevent future waves of drone strikes. The stalled oil tanker fleet is the strongest evidence during the campaign's peak week. Only 4 ships loaded cargo at Primorsk compared to the usual 10, equivalent to a 60% decrease. At Ust-Luga, the situation is even worse with a decrease of up to 80%. The inevitable consequence is that Russia's oil revenue has plummeted. From an average export of over 4 million barrels per day, this number has hit a low of only 2.3 million barrels. This is a painful loss in the context of rising global oil prices due to geopolitical turmoil in Iran. Instead of taking advantage of the opportunity to fill its treasury, Russia has to watch its revenue being squeezed. Specifically, even though the price of Russian crude oil has risen to over $73 per barrel, revenue in the last week of March was only $1.44 billion, a drop of more than $1 billion compared to the previous week. Ukraine's goal is to destroy the financial resources the Kremlin uses to fuel its war machine. Russia once hoped for an economic lifeline when Western sanctions revealed loopholes and energy prices soared. However, Ukraine has changed the game with precise and persistent strikes. What Moscow hoped to gain has now gone up in flames under enemy fire at the Baltic ports. In just 7 days, Ukraine has pushed the Russian economy, which had just shown a glimmer of hope, back onto the path of rapid decline. Although Western sanctions have somewhat weakened Russia's ability to wage war, with estimated losses of about $100 billion as of August 2025. But it is these direct strikes on the energy lifeline that have created the most immediate and devastating changes on the current geopolitical chessboard. Looking at the big picture of this confrontation, we see a harsh reality. The figure of $100 billion in damages after more than 3 years of countless sanctions still seems like just a small scratch compared to the massive cash flow that Russia earns from energy. A painful paradox has occurred when, in 2024 alone, oil and gas revenue for Moscow still reached $235 billion, even slightly increasing compared to the previous year. These figures are like a bucket of cold water poured on the West's efforts, as Russia has lost less than 4% of its revenue compared to the period before the global pandemic. So, clearly, the economic protection measures have not brought the devastating results that Ukraine expected. On the contrary, it has allowed Mr. Putin to maintain abundant financial resources to fuel the war machine. The emergence of the Ghost Fleet, which the Kremlin has spent over $14 billion to build, is the key that allows the illegal flow of oil to quietly spread around the world, creating a long-standing problem for international policymakers. Although the sanctions look impressive in the media and have indeed had some impact, in reality, their implementation has not yet reached the level needed to break the opponent's will. In that context, the launch of the Epic V and Zoringlian campaigns in Iran, despite showcasing the absolute firepower of the United States, has unintentionally become a lifeline for the Russian economy. The chaos in the Strait of Hormuz caused by Iran's asymmetric tactics has directly pushed global oil prices higher, turning the world's concerns into triumphant smiles for the elite in Moscow. In just the first 2 weeks after the conflict in Iran broke out, Russia quickly pocketed nearly $7 billion from fossil fuels, marking a 14% increase compared to the previous month. This is an unexpected windfall profit, directly flowing into the treasury to fund military campaigns in Ukraine. Even more tragic for sanctions, by late March, Russian oil was no longer discounted and was even sold above international prices due to the Gulf supply shock. After a $1.12 discount, Russian oil suddenly became up to $4 per barrel pricier than Brent crude, a direct blow to price cap policies. Amidst this heated situation, a highly controversial decision from the U.S. caused a public outcry. Washington temporarily eased part of the sanctions on Russian cargo ships until April 11 to calm the surge in oil prices. Although this is only a temporary measure, it has faced strong opposition from European leaders. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and French President Emmanuel Macron did not hesitate to criticize this move as unnecessary and unfounded, expressing concerns that even a small concession could set a dangerous precedent for lifting sanctions in the future. From the battlefield, President Volodymyr Zelensky also issued a stern warning during his meeting with Macron, stating that this relaxation could aid Russia. $10 billion were spent on the war, undermining efforts to achieve peace. While U.S. President Donald Trump declared that he would soon end the chaos in Iran in the coming weeks, for Ukraine, every moment of delay is paid for in blood. Refusing to stand by and watch the other side take advantage of political loopholes, Ukraine decided to enforce sanctions in its own way, using drones. That is the reason why the Ust-Luga and Plymouth ports have become targets engulfed in flames. With up to 40% of Russia's total export capacity, These two ports are being tightly targeted by Ukraine in an unprecedented long-range campaign. Geopolitical analysts, notably experts like Boris Ehrenstein, have had to admit that what has happened in the past week is the most serious threat to Russia's oil exports since the war began. Ukraine has demonstrated the ability to penetrate air defense fire to strike at vital targets, something that Russia has yet to find an effective solution for after many days of bombardment. These airstrikes not only cause material damage, but also serve as a strategic message to Putin. The economic lifelines of the Baltic region could be permanently paralyzed. If in the first 2 weeks of the epic FIV campaign, Russia could rejoice over huge profits, now as key seaports are on the verge of being wiped out, that $7 billion figure is at serious risk of dropping, pushing the Kremlin into a looming crisis right in its own backyard. Let's do a grim calculation about what just happened. When 40% of export capacity evaporates, Russia's oil revenue doesn't just decrease, it's in free fall. If we take the figure of $235 billion in oil and gas income in 2024 as a benchmark, then losing the choke points in the Baltic region will bring this number down to only $141 billion. The real significance here isn't just the lifeless numbers on the balance sheet. Ukraine's airstrikes have proven that the Russian economy can be dealt crippling blows in just a short week. Just imagine if these raids lasted for a month or even a year, how terrifying the scenario would be. The once peaceful Baltic Sea could turn into a sea of fire, where no sane captain would dare sail an oil tanker into it. That means tens of billions of dollars would be drained from Putin's war budget, and this terrible story doesn't end there. Another shadow is looming, called Siberia. If Putin thinks that the disaster at the Baltic ports was already a nightmare, he'll be terrified to realize that Ukraine is putting the pieces together to bring down his entire economic lifeline. According to analyses from United, the Ust-Luga and Krymos seaports are actually just the endpoints of a massive oil supply chain from Siberia, including the Dushba pipeline and two strategic refineries, Kirishinev Calcite and Zagorsk-Lavov. In total, these facilities are responsible for 2.6 million barrels of oil per day, accounting for nearly 1/3 of Russia's total oil exports. Now, with Ust-Luga and Krymos paralyzed, the Dushba pipeline has also ceased operations since January, causing a severe supply disruption for Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and many other Central European countries. 3 of the 5 most critical links have been dismantled. The 4th link was attacked right during the hellish week when Ukraine unleashed firepower on the Kirishinev Calcite oil refinery. This strike was so powerful that it forced the plant to shut down completely, directly eliminating a large amount of refined petroleum products that Russia could export. And for Zagorsk-Lavov, the scenario unfolded in an equally tragic way. On March 28, thick black columns of smoke rose from this plant after a drone bombing. One by one, each point on the energy map is being wiped out. While the world's attention is focused on Ust-Luga, or Kwaimat, behind the scenes, Ukraine is carrying out an unprecedented, meticulously calculated campaign to break the entire supply chain in the Siberian region. The previous sporadic attacks have ended, giving way to a deep, methodical, and systematic offensive strategy targeting the critical choke points of the Russian economy. This is the Kremlin's worst nightmare. Putin has gradually lost his most valuable strategic assets as the Russian economy stagnates and begins to show signs of exhaustion. Not only Western experts, but even the Central Bank of Russia and leading economic institutes in Moscow are also reporting alarming figures. The Russian economy has entered a recession since November 2025, and things will only get worse. Ukraine is cornering Russia in a life-or-death match. The challenge now is to maintain that pressure. The hellish week that just passed needs to be followed by a series of continuous attacks, with punishing follow-up blows to ensure the Siberian supply chain has no chance to recover. Kyiv's current strategic goal is to maintain the paralysis of this system. The recent temporary shutdowns are just the first step in proving the effectiveness of the new weapons. But if Ukraine persists, even after Operation Epic Fury ends, Russia's infrastructure will not be able to recover. The current losses of billions of dollars could quickly turn into tens of billions, enough to create political pressure, forcing Mr. Putin to end the invasion. While Russia is struggling to patch up its wounds that keep being torn open, Ukraine is growing stronger than ever. Strategic agreements in the Middle East promise Kiev a sustainable financial and military future. All of this stems from hard-earned lessons and remarkable growth in the direct confrontation with the Russian giant. In your opinion, how will Ukraine's direct attacks on the Siberian oil supply chain affect Russia's ability to sustain the war in the coming months?